There is a city beneath the city. Right now, somewhere below the pavements of London, below the tube lines and the utility pipes and the buried rivers and the basements of Georgian townhouses, there is a street. It is a Roman street. It has been there for nearly 2,000 years, and if you could somehow descend through 30 feet of accumulated earth and debris and centuries and silence, you would find it exactly as it was left. The stone surface still intact in places, the wheel ruts still pressed into the roadway, the drainage channels still running along the edges in the precise configuration that Roman engineers designed them. The city above it has no idea it is walking on top of another city. That is the thing about London that most people never fully sit with. Every bus stop, every coffee shop, every apartment block, every park bench is resting on top of a ghost. Not metaphorically, literally. The ground beneath London contains the physical remains of a Roman city called Londinium, a city that was, at its height, one of the most important urban centres in the entire Roman Empire. A city with a forum larger than Trafalgar Square. A city with a port that handled more cargo than any harbour in Britain has seen since. A city with walls, still standing today, incorporated silently into the foundations of office buildings, glimpsed through protective glass panels in underground car parks, preserved in the basements of pubs that have been serving drinks for centuries without anyone remarking on what the brickwork behind them actually is. And the story of that city, the real story, the one that archaeologists have been piecing together for over 100 years with increasing urgency and increasingly precise tools, changes almost everything we thought we understood about Britain, about how it became what it is, about what was here before, about the period of transformation that reshaped an entire island and left marks so deep that we are still living inside them. That is what we are going to spend the next 2 hours exploring together. So, if you are lying down, if the lights are low, if the world outside has quieted itself into something manageable, let yourself settle. We are going to go somewhere most people never go. We are going 30 feet down. We are going back almost 2,000 years. And we are going to walk through a city that has been waiting, very patiently, for someone to pay attention to it. Let us start at the beginning. Not the Roman beginning, the beginning before that. The Thames is older than you can comfortably imagine. Before the city, before the bridge, before the first settlement on those low gravel hills, the Thames was already one of the most significant geographical features in the landscape of Britain. It was wide, wider than it is now in most places. Its banks were marshy and uncertain, shifting with the tides in ways that made the ground unreliable. The river itself ran through a floodplain bordered by gentle hills to the north and south, and in certain places, particularly in the area we now call central London, the river narrowed slightly, the gravel shores extended, and crossing became just barely possible. That crossing point mattered more than almost any other geographical feature in the eventual history of what would become one of the world's great cities. Think about what a river crossing means to a society without bridges. It means that a river which functions as a barrier in every other location becomes, at the crossing point, a meeting place. Goods from the south of Britain moving north had to cross there. People moving east or west along the southern bank eventually funneled toward it. Trade, travel, communication, everything that required movement across the river, everything gradually oriented itself toward that particular narrowing of the Thames. We do not know exactly what was at that crossing point before the Romans arrived. The evidence is fragmentary, as it always is when we are trying to see that far back. There were people. That much is certain. Britain was not empty when the Romans came. It was inhabited by Iron Age communities of considerable sophistication, people who farmed the land and worked metal and traded with the continent, and built complex social structures with their own hierarchies and religions and ways of understanding the world. The tribes of what is now southeast England were in regular contact with Gaul. Some of them used coins. Some of them built substantial settlements that the Romans would later describe, using the Latin word as oppida. Whether there was anything substantial at the Thames crossing before 43 AD is one of the genuinely contested questions in London archaeology. The traditional view, held for most of the 20th century, was that the area was essentially uninhabited marsh and scrubland, and that the Romans created London from nothing, a blank slate upon which a city was imposed. That view has been under pressure for a long time now. Excavations in the area around Southwark, on the south bank of the river, have uncovered evidence of activity in the late Iron Age period, just before the Roman arrival. Pottery, structural timbers, the kind of material that suggests people were not merely passing through, but were establishing something, however temporary or seasonal. There are Iron Age finds from the North Bank as well, scattered and difficult to interpret, but present. What this means exactly is still debated. It may mean there was a small community at the crossing. It may mean the area was used for trade or ceremony. It may mean nothing more than that people crossed the river here and occasionally left things behind. But it changes the story in an important way, because if there was something at the Thames crossing before the Romans, then Londinium was not created in a vacuum. It was built on top of a place that already had meaning, already had use, already had, in whatever form, some kind of human presence. The Romans did not arrive in an empty landscape. They arrived in a landscape full of people and history. And then they changed everything. They arrived in 43 AD. And the story of what happened next begins not in London, but on the beaches of the Kent coast, on a grey morning in late summer, with the largest military force Britain had ever seen stepping off ships onto the shingle. The Emperor Claudius was not supposed to be emperor. He was the fourth emperor of Rome, following in the footsteps of Augustus, Tiberius, and the deeply unstable Caligula, and he had spent most of his life being overlooked. He had a stammer. He walked with a limp. He was considered by his own family to be embarrassing, and had been largely kept out of public life as a result. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, and the Praetorian Guard, in one of history's more chaotic moments, found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declared him emperor, most people in Rome assumed it would not last long. Claudius understood that he needed a military victory, not a small skirmish, a real conquest. Something that would silence the senators who considered him a joke and cement his authority in the only currency that truly mattered in Rome, which was military success. He chose Britain. Julius Caesar had come to Britain a century earlier, in 55 and 54 BC, and had not quite conquered it. He had crossed the Channel twice, fought some engagements, received the submission of some tribes, and gone home. Britain had remained tantalizingly unconquered, on the edge of the known world, and Claudius saw an opportunity. The force he sent was substantial. 4 legions, approximately 40,000 soldiers, plus auxiliaries and support personnel. The 2nd Legion Augusta, the 9th Legion Hispana, the 14th Legion Gemina, the 20th Legion Valeria Victrix. Under the command of a general named Aulus Plautius, a force designed not for a raid but for a conquest, carrying with it everything needed to establish permanent Roman presence. Surveyors, engineers, administrators, medical personnel, supply chains. They crossed the Channel. The precise landing point is still debated, but the Richborough area of Kent is the most favoured candidate, and there are the ruins of a Roman monument there still. built later to commemorate the conquest, which gives the location a certain weight of tradition. They came ashore. They fought. The British tribes under Caraticus and his brother Togodumnus resisted at the River Medway, in an engagement that lasted 2 days, which was unusual, most Roman battles being over far more quickly. The Romans won. They pushed north and west. Togodumnus was killed. Caraticus fled. And Aulus Plautius paused at the Thames. Here is where our story narrows its focus. Aulus Plautius, standing on the south bank of the Thames, somewhere in the vicinity of what would become London Bridge, sending a message back to Rome. He has reached the river. He needs instructions. He needs, specifically, the emperor himself. Claudius came to Britain. He was there for 16 days, enough time to personally command the final advance across the river and the capture of the British capital at Camulodunum, which is modern Colchester. He then returned to Rome in triumph, where he celebrated and named his son Britannicus after the conquest, which tells you everything about how important this moment was to him politically. But the crucial moment, the one that matters for our story, is the crossing of the Thames. Aulus Plautius had found the place where the river could be crossed. The gravel shores, the relatively shallow ford, the low hills on the north bank. He crossed. His army crossed. They established a presence on the north bank of the Thames, and in that action, in that military crossing of a river on a grey morning, somewhere around the year 43 AD, London was born. Not immediately, not yet as a city, but the presence was established, the ground was taken, the engineers began to survey, and the Roman instinct for identifying a good location and building on it began to assert itself with the systematic efficiency that made the empire what it was. The Romans looked at the low gravel hills on the north bank of the Thames, at the natural harbour the river provided, at the crossing point they had just used, and they made a decision. This would be their base. This would be their supply hub. This would be where the roads spread out from, connecting the newly conquered province to itself. This would be Londinium. The Romans built fast. That is one of the things that is easy to forget when you are looking at Roman remains, which tend to be ancient and worn and surrounded by the patina of centuries. The Romans themselves were not ancient. They were efficient. They were pragmatic. They moved quickly. They built systematically, and they thought in terms of infrastructure first. The first thing they needed was a bridge. The Thames crossing that the army had used was a ford, workable for soldiers in summer, but not for the year-round movement of goods and people that a functioning supply base required. A bridge was necessary, and the Romans built one. The exact date is uncertain, but most archaeologists place it within the first decade of the conquest, so somewhere around 43 to 52 AD. It stood very close to where London Bridge stands today, making London Bridge one of the longest-serving geographical concepts in British history, the idea of a crossing at that precise point having persisted for nearly 2,000 years. The bridge changed everything immediately. A fixed crossing of the Thames was, in the landscape of Roman Britain, an event of enormous geographical consequence. All roads, quite literally, began to lead to it. The Roman road network, which was already being laid out across the new province with extraordinary speed, oriented itself toward the bridge. From the south, roads came up through what is now Surrey and Kent. From the north and west and east, roads spread out toward every corner of the province. And at the centre of the web, on the north bank of the river beside the bridge, Londinium sat. It is important to understand what Londinium was in those early years. It was not, initially, a military base. There is no evidence of a legionary fortress at London in the early period. The legions went elsewhere, to establish military control across the province. Londinium was something different. It was a civilian settlement, a commercial centre. a trading hub that grew up organically around the bridge and the river crossing, attracting merchants and craftspeople and service providers of every kind. The port was the beating heart of it. The Thames waterfront in the 1st century AD was a busy, noisy, productive stretch of river. Timber quays extended into the river. Ships from the continent arrived carrying wine and olive oil and fine pottery and glass and luxury goods of every kind. Ships left carrying British metal and grain and slaves and hunting dogs, which were apparently considered excellent by Roman standards and were exported specifically for their quality. The movement of goods in and out of Londinium in those early decades was constant and substantial. The town grew. It grew quickly and in somewhat chaotic fashion, as towns that grow organically around commerce tend to do. Timber buildings went up. Streets were laid out, following the Roman preference for a grid pattern where the terrain allowed, but adapting where it did not. The hills and the valleys of the North Bank influenced the layout in ways you can still trace in the street plan of the modern City of London, if you know how to look at it. By around 60 AD, estimates suggest Londinium had a population of somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people. It was not a large city by Roman standards. It did not yet have the monumental architecture that would come later. But it was growing fast. It was prosperous. It was, by every measure available to us, thriving. And then, everything burned. Her name comes down to us through Roman sources, which means we are seeing her through the eyes of people who both feared her and ultimately defeated her, which is not an ideal historical perspective. The Roman writers Tacitus and Cassius Dio give us the most detailed accounts, and they are accounts written by men who had reasons to make her both terrible and sympathetic, because her terrible nature justified the Roman response, and her sympathetic qualities made the eventual victory more impressive. We take what we can from sources like these, and we try to see through them to something closer to the truth. What we know is this. Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now Norfolk, had been a client king under Roman authority, a common arrangement in the provinces where local rulers were allowed to remain in place as long as they cooperated with Roman administration. He died around 60 AD and left his kingdom jointly to his 2 daughters and to the Roman emperor. It was an attempt to secure his family's position under the new order. The Romans ignored the will entirely. They seized the Iceni territory as a province. Roman officials and soldiers behaved in ways that Tacitus, who was Roman himself, describes as plundering and ransacking. Boudica, the widow of Prasutagus, was flogged. Her daughters were assaulted. What happened next was one of the most significant uprisings in the history of Roman Britain. Boudica raised an army. The Iceni joined her. The Trinovantes tribe of Essex, who had their own grievances with the Romans, joined her. Other groups joined her. The force that assembled was enormous by the standards of the province. Estimates range widely, but Tacitus suggests a number that, even discounted for ancient rhetorical inflation, indicates something very large indeed. They moved south. Camulodunum, the Roman capital at Colchester, was their first target. It fell. The Roman civilian population was massacred. The temple of Claudius, which had become a symbol of Roman authority and a financial burden imposed on the local population, was destroyed. Londinium was next. The Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus was in Wales at the time, campaigning against the Druids on the island of Anglesey. He rushed back east when he heard the news. He came to Londinium. He assessed the situation. He did not have enough soldiers to defend the city, and so he made the decision that all commanders make when they cannot win a defensive action, and must preserve their force for a future engagement. He ordered the evacuation of Londinium and withdrew his army. The people who could leave left. The people who could not, or who chose not to, stayed. And then Boudica's army arrived. What happened to Londinium in approximately 60 or 61 AD is preserved not primarily in any written record. It is preserved in the ground. It is preserved as a layer of burnt red clay and ash and debris that runs beneath the modern city at a depth of roughly 30 feet, identifiable in excavations across a wide area of what was Roman London. Archaeologists call it the Boudican destruction layer. It is about 10 centimeters thick in most places, bright red or dark orange in color, depending on what burned above it. And it is consistent. Everywhere you find it, across the entire area of the first Londinium, the layer says the same thing. This place burned. It burned completely. It burned to the ground. In the Boudican destruction layer, archaeologists have found the detritus of a functioning town at the moment of its destruction. Pottery still intact inside the ash of the buildings it had been stored in. Food remains, grain and dates and lentils preserved by carbonization. Personal objects, jewelry and tools and writing implements. The physical contents of a town that was there on one day and gone the next. There were people in Londinium who did not evacuate. Their remains have been found in excavations scattered across the destruction layer, the skeletal remains of individuals who were caught in the catastrophe. A skull found in the Thames near the waterfront. Human remains in the debris of buildings. The people who stayed, or who could not leave, are there in the ground of London still. Suetonius eventually regrouped, selected his ground, and fought Boudica's army in a pitched battle somewhere in the Midlands, the exact site of which remains unknown despite considerable archaeological effort to locate it. He won decisively. Boudica died, by suicide according to Tacitus, or by illness according to Cassius Dio. The uprising collapsed, and then the Romans came back to London. The Romans looked at what was left of Londinium after the destruction, which was not much, and they decided to rebuild it. Not just to rebuild it, to build it better. To build it in a way that reflected what they intended this city to be. The second Londinium, the one that rose from the destruction layer of the first, was a different kind of city from its predecessor. The first Londinium had been a commercial settlement, organic and timber-built, growing around trade and opportunity. The second Londinium was planned. It was monumental. It was built with the full weight of Roman imperial investment behind it, stone and mortar and tile and ambition. The Forum was the centerpiece. A Roman forum was not simply a marketplace, though it functioned as one. It was the civic and commercial heart of a Roman city. It was where legal cases were heard, where merchants gathered, where official announcements were made, where the administration of the province conducted its public business. A forum expressed, in physical form, the power and organization of Rome. The Forum of Londinium, as it stood in its final form in the late 1st and 2nd centuries AD, was enormous. Archaeologists have traced its footprint beneath the modern city of London, and the numbers are extraordinary. The Forum complex, including the surrounding basilica, covered an area of approximately 3 hectares. The basilica, the great hall that formed the northern side of the complex, was the largest building ever constructed in Roman Britain. It was larger than any building in Britain built since, until Westminster Hall was constructed in the 11th century. Stand at Gracechurch Street in the City of London today, at the junction with Leadenhall Street and Fenchurch Street, and you are standing approximately in the middle of where the Forum was. There is a blue heritage plaque on a building there acknowledging the fact. Beneath the road surface, beneath the Victorian drains and the cable runs and the foundations of the buildings around you, the remains of the Forum are still there, some of them surveyed in detail and some of them not yet touched. The Forum was surrounded by a city that had rebuilt itself with confidence. New streets, new buildings, many of them stone-fronted, even if their upper stories were timber. New temples and bathhouses, and the infrastructure of a functioning Roman city. The population recovered, the trade resumed. The port on the Thames waterfront was expanded, with new timber quays extending into the river, the largest of which have been dated to around 70 to 80 AD. By the end of the 1st century, Londinium was arguably the most important city in the province. Camulodunum at Colchester had been the first capital, but Londinium had eclipsed it. It was larger, it was richer, it was better positioned on the river and the road network. Sometime around the end of the 1st century, the provincial administration formally shifted its centre to Londinium, and the city became what it would remain for the next 3 centuries, the de facto capital of Roman Britain. There was a governor's palace. Its remains have been found beneath Cannon Street and the area around the Thames waterfront, and they are impressive by any standard. A complex of buildings with tessellated floors and painted walls, and a formal garden leading down to the river. The kind of residence designed to project the power and culture of Rome to anyone who visited. There was an amphitheatre. Its remains lie beneath the Guildhall Art Gallery in the City of London, and you can go there today and stand in the actual space of it. The curved walls preserved up to a height of several feet in a basement exhibition space, looking at the arena floor where gladiators fought, and where executions took place, and where crowds of Roman Londoners gathered for the entertainments that were, for the Roman world, as central to civic life as anything else. There were temples, there were bathhouses, there was a Mithraeum, a temple to the god Mithras, about which we will have much more to say later, because the story of its discovery in the 20th century is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of London archaeology. There was, in short, a city, a real city, a city of stone and tile and painted plaster, of running water and heated floors, of shops and workshops and schools and religious buildings and administrative centres. A city of tens of thousands of people going about their lives in the shadow of the most powerful empire the Western world had ever seen. And beneath it all, beneath the Forum and the Basilica and the governor's palace and the amphitheatre and the temples and the bathhouses, beneath all of that, 3 feet down from the Roman street level, was the Boudican destruction layer. The red ash of the first Londinium, the record of everything that had been destroyed and replaced. That is the archaeology of London. Layer upon layer upon layer. Each generation building on top of the last, each new city rising from the ruins of what came before. Around 200 AD, perhaps a little before or a little after, the people of Londinium built a wall. Not a small wall, not a boundary marker or a modest fortification. A wall. 3 miles in circumference, up to 18 feet high in places, 6 to 8 feet thick at the base, constructed from ragstone quarried in Kent, brought upriver on barges, assembled by Roman engineers and builders working with the systematic precision that was the hallmark of Roman construction. A wall that enclosed an area of approximately 330 acres, making the defended area of Londinium larger than any other walled city in Roman Britain. We do not know exactly why they built it. That might seem surprising. Something of this scale, this cost, this engineering investment, you would expect the reasons to be clear. But they are not. The late 2nd century was a period of political instability in the Roman Empire, and there were various external pressures on Britain during this period, including raids from tribes in the north. The wall may have been a defensive response to genuine military threat. It may have been a statement of civic pride and wealth, because building a wall was also a way of proclaiming that your city was important enough to be worth protecting. It may have been both. What we do know is that they built it, and it lasted. The London Wall, as it came to be known in medieval times, is one of the most remarkable survivals of Roman engineering anywhere in Britain. It was so well built that it remained the effective boundary of the city for over 1,000 years after the Romans left. The medieval city of London grew up largely within the Roman walls, using them, repairing them, building against them and into them, incorporating them into the foundations of later buildings. By the time the medieval wall was finally dismantled in the modern era, large sections had been so thoroughly absorbed into subsequent construction that removing the Roman core would have required demolishing buildings that had been standing for centuries. Today, fragments of the London Wall are visible in several places across the City of London. At Tower Hill, a substantial section stands in a sunken garden beside the Underground station, preserved behind iron railings, the Roman core clearly visible at the base, and the medieval repairs rising above it. In the basement of a building in Cripplegate, sections of the wall have been preserved in situ, visible through reinforced glass. In the churchyard of St. Alphage on London Wall, chunks of the Roman and medieval structure rise from the ground beside a public garden where office workers eat their lunches without necessarily knowing what they are sitting next to. The wall had gates: Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Newgate, Aldersgate, Cripplegate, Ludgate. The names of these gates survive in the street names and place names of modern London, one of the most direct connections between the Roman city and the city you would walk through today. When you hear the word Bishopsgate or Newgate or Aldgate in a London address, you are hearing the echo of a Roman entrance through a Roman wall. On the riverside, where the Thames served as a natural barrier, the wall initially ran along the waterfront. Later, probably in the 4th century, a riverside wall was added, connecting the two ends and completing the enclosure on the south side as well. Inside the wall, the city continued to function. Outside the wall, cemeteries. The Romans, like all ancient Mediterranean cultures, buried their dead outside the city limits. The cemeteries of Londinium extended beyond the gates in every direction, and they have been a constant source of archaeological discovery since the Victorian era, when building works repeatedly turned up Roman burials. We will spend more time with the dead of Londinium later, because the cemeteries tell us things about the city and the people who lived there that no other source can. For now, what matters is the wall, because the wall defines something. It defines the shape of the Roman city in a way that no other structure does. Within its 3-mile circuit, everything we are going to discuss about Londinium existed. Everything that was built and lived in and traded and worshipped and governed. The wall is the container for the story, and its stones are in the ground of London still, 30 feet down in some places, level with the modern surface in others, standing above it in a few. The wall is not gone. It is simply waiting to be noticed. We have been talking about monuments, about forums and basilicas and walls and palaces, the kind of Roman London that is easy to discuss, because it was large and built of stone and left substantial remains. But Londinium was not made of monuments. It was made of people. Tens of thousands of people. At its peak, probably between the late 1st century and the middle of the 2nd century, the population of Londinium may have reached 50 to 60,000. Some estimates go higher. It was a genuinely large city for its time, comparable in scale to many significant urban centres in the Roman world. And the people who lived in it were not senators or generals or emperors. They were merchants and craftspeople, and slaves and freed people, and soldiers and prostitutes and priests and shopkeepers and children, and administrators and river pilots and dock workers, and every other human category that makes up a functioning city. We know about them from archaeology. We know about them from objects. The excavations of Roman London have produced an extraordinary quantity of small, personal, intimate objects that tell us things about daily life that the monumental buildings never could. Writing tablets, hundreds of them, preserved in the waterlogged conditions of the Thames waterfront, thin sheets of wood coated in wax, the writing impressed into the wax, and then the message scraped off and the tablet reused. Most of the writing is mundane in the best possible way. Business transactions, a loan agreement, a complaint about a bad debt, an instruction to a slave, a letter from one merchant to another about a shipment of goods. One of the earliest writing tablets found in London, discovered during excavations for the Bloomberg building near Cannon Street, contains a text dated to approximately 57 AD. It records a financial transaction involving a sum of money. The person writing it is discussing debt and repayment with the business-like precision of someone whose entire life is built around commerce. The tablet was written in London by a Roman Londoner, while Boudica was still alive, while the city that would be destroyed 3 years later was still standing, while everything that was about to burn was still intact. There is something quietly devastating about holding that in your mind. The shoes tell us things too. Roman shoes are found regularly in the waterlogged deposits along the Thames waterfront, where the anaerobic conditions have preserved organic materials for nearly 2,000 years. Leather shoes, adult shoes and children's shoes, working shoes with heavy soles and delicate sandals. The shoes of poor people and the shoes of people who could afford quality craftsmanship. In the debris of a single Roman waterfront deposit, you might find the shoes of a dozen different individuals, each one slightly different, each one carrying in its wear pattern and its repair history the traces of a particular human body walking through a particular life. The graffiti survives too in some cases. Not on walls generally, because most Roman London walls were timber or painted plaster, materials that do not preserve graffiti well, but on pottery, scratched into the clay before or after firing. Names, numbers, short messages, the scratch of a knife on a piece of broken pot, someone marking their property or leaving a message, or simply, for reasons we will never know, writing something in a moment of impulse. The impulse has survived 2,000 years. The district of Roman London immediately behind the waterfront was the commercial core of the city. Warehouses for storing imported goods, workshops where craftspeople processed raw materials, shops with counters facing the street. The area around what is now Cornhill and Gracechurch Street was dense with commercial activity, a tightly packed urban environment of small businesses and workshops and the infrastructure of trade. To the west, across the Fleet River, was an area that was slightly less densely built, and the excavations at Newgate Street and in the area around modern St Paul's Cathedral have revealed domestic buildings. The houses of Londinium's residents, with their tessellated floors and their painted walls, and the hypercaust systems that circulated warm air beneath the floors of the wealthier homes. Hypercausts. It is worth pausing on these for a moment, because they are both technically impressive and deeply human. A Roman hypercaust is an underfloor heating system. A furnace outside the building burns wood. The heat circulates through a space beneath the raised floor, supported on small columns of tile. The floor above, often concrete or stone, is warm to walk on. In a British winter, with rain and cold wind outside, walking on a warm floor in a heated room is a luxury that most of the population of Iron Age Britain had never had access to. The Romans brought it with them, and they built it not just in the governor's palace, but in the private houses of successful merchants and administrators. London is cold in winter. It was cold in Roman times too. The experience of walking into a heated room with a warm floor on a grey January morning is not something that has changed between Roman times and now. The desire for warmth and comfort is constant. The Romans satisfied that desire with engineering, and the people of Londinium lived in buildings that were, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely comfortable. They ate well, too, by the standards of most of the population of Roman Britain. The port brought food from across the empire, wine from Gaul and Spain and Italy, olive oil from Spain and North Africa, figs and dates and other dried fruits from the Mediterranean, fish sauce, the ubiquitous Roman condiment that was to ancient cooking roughly what soy sauce is to East Asian cuisine. The residents of Londinium ate a more varied and cosmopolitan diet than almost anyone else in the province. They also ate locally. Oysters from the Thames estuary, found in such quantities in Roman London deposits that they must have been a staple food for a wide range of the population. Venison and wild boar from hunting, fish from the river, grain from the fields of the province. The diet of Londinium was a combination of the Mediterranean and the local, Rome and Britain, layered together in the same way the city itself was layered. This is the question that has occupied archaeologists and historians for decades, and that modern scientific techniques have begun, in the last 20 years, to answer in ways that are genuinely surprising. The short answer is people from everywhere. Londinium, like all major Roman cities, was a cosmopolitan place, a port city, a trading hub, an administrative centre for a major province of the empire. People came to it from across the Roman world, and they stayed. Some came as soldiers, some came as merchants, some came as slaves, some came as administrators, some came looking for opportunity, in the way that people have always moved towards cities looking for opportunity. Isotope analysis on skeletal remains from Roman London cemeteries has revealed individuals whose childhood was spent in places as far from Britain as the Mediterranean coast, North Africa, and possibly even further east. The bones record where a person grew up through the chemical signature of the water they drank during their childhood, and those signatures point to origins that span an extraordinary geographical range. One of the most striking examples is the individual known as the Spitalfields Roman, a woman whose remains were found in a lead coffin in the Roman cemetery at Spitalfields, buried with objects of considerable wealth and quality. She was buried with care, with objects that indicated status and comfort. She was buried with a glass mirror and a jet pin, and fine textiles that had partially survived. Her coffin was one of the wealthiest burials from Roman London yet found. Isotope analysis of her bones showed that she did not grow up in Britain. The chemical signature of her tooth enamel points to a childhood spent in a region of warmer climate, possibly the Mediterranean, possibly southern Europe. She came to Londinium as an adult, or at least as a young person past early childhood. She achieved, or was born into, a position of some wealth. She died in Londinium. She was buried with the care and respect due to someone of status. We do not know her name. We do not know how she got here or why. We do not know what her life was like in this city at the edge of the empire. But she is there, in the ground beneath Spitalfields, and she has been there for approximately 1700 years, and the story her bones tell is of a world that was more connected and more cosmopolitan than most people, thinking about Roman Britain, imagine it to have been. There are other individuals. A man buried near Aldgate, whose isotope analysis suggests an origin in North Africa or the Middle East. A group of individuals from the Southwark Cemetery, whose geographic origins are varied and scattered across the empire. The population of Londinium, as revealed by the chemistry of its bones, was not a population of British natives, with a thin layer of Roman military overlords. It was a genuine mix. A city population with all the diversity that major port cities in connected economic systems tend to produce. The sources of people were multiple. Soldiers were posted to Britain from across the empire, and veterans often settled in the provinces where they had served. Merchants followed the trade routes. The slave trade was a significant part of the Roman economy, and enslaved people were moved from their places of origin to wherever they were needed, which means that some of the people buried in Roman London cemeteries arrived not by choice, but by force. Freed people, enslaved individuals who had been manumitted, were a significant part of the Roman urban population and were often economically active and sometimes successful. The religions of Londinium reflected this diversity. The official Roman state religion was present, with temples to the Capitoline deities, Jupiter and Juno and Minerva. But there were other temples. Eastern mystery religions were popular in Roman cities across the empire, and Londinium had them. The Temple of Mithras, to which we will return, is the most famous example. There was apparently also a temple to Isis, one of the most widely worshipped Egyptian deities in the Roman world, whose influence spread far beyond Egypt along the trade and military routes of the empire. A small ceramic flask found in a Southwark excavation bears an inscription referring to Isis, and the site of a possible Isis temple has been proposed, though not yet definitively located. The Latin writing on the tablets from Londinium is the Latin of business and administration, not the elegant prose of Roman literature. It is functional and direct, the language of people who have a transaction to record, a debt to document, a complaint to register. It is the kind of Latin you would expect from a commercial port city at the edge of the empire. But not everyone in Londinium spoke Latin. The native population of Britain spoke a Celtic language, the ancestor of modern Welsh and Cornish, and in many contexts, particularly outside the city, British remained the primary language for centuries of Roman occupation. The graffiti on pottery includes marks that appear to be in a non-Latin script. The personal names recorded in the Latin texts include many that are clearly Celtic British in origin. Londinium was bilingual at minimum, and probably more linguistically complex than that. A city of many languages, many religions, many origins, sitting on the Thames 30 feet below the modern surface. The bones are there. The writing tablets are there. The shoes and the pottery and the jewellery and the coins are there. The evidence of all those lives accumulated over 3 centuries of occupation, waiting in the ground to be found. The Romans buried their dead outside the city. It was law, not custom, a specific legal prohibition on burials within the city limits that reflected Roman beliefs about the separation of the living and the dead. And so, around Londinium, outside the gates of the wall and beyond the earlier limits of the unwalled city, the cemeteries grew. The Eastern Cemetery, outside Aldgate, has been one of the most intensively excavated. The Museum of London holds thousands of objects from it, accumulated over decades of excavation, as building works in the area repeatedly encountered Roman burials. The Western Cemetery, outside Newgate, running along what is now Newgate Street and the Old Bailey, was another major burial ground. South of the river, in Southwark, there were cemeteries on the gravel islands between the marshes, and these too have produced significant numbers of burials. The ways in which people were buried changed over the period of Roman occupation. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, cremation was dominant. The body was burned on a funeral pyre, and the cremated remains were placed in a container, often a ceramic pot, sometimes a glass vessel, occasionally a lead canister, and buried in the ground, often with accompanying grave goods, food and drink for the journey, personal possessions, coins for the ferryman. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, inhumation, burial of the intact body, had become more common, reflecting the influence of Eastern religions, including early Christianity, which preferred burial to cremation. The cemeteries of Roman London thus contain both types, and the transition between them is one of the ways archaeologists track broad cultural change across the period. The grave goods tell individual stories. A child buried with a small pottery dog, a toy companion for the journey. A woman buried with a set of cosmetic implements, tweezers and a small spoon for applying makeup, suggesting that the person who arranged her burial thought she would need or want these objects wherever she was going. A man buried with a set of surgical instruments, their bronze handles and iron blades still identifiable after 17 centuries, suggesting he was a doctor or a person who worked with the sick. An individual buried with a lamp that was placed beside the head, perhaps to light the darkness of the afterlife. The poorest burials have no grave goods at all. A body in the ground, sometimes in a wooden coffin, sometimes not. The absence of objects is itself information. It tells us about poverty and the way poverty persisted across millennia. The way a person without money in Roman London was buried just as plainly as a person without money anywhere at any time. One category of burial deserves particular attention because it has generated considerable discussion in recent years: the so-called decapitated burials. Individuals buried with the skull placed between the feet or beside the knees or otherwise separated from the body. These burials have been found across Britain and in Roman cemeteries in Europe, and their meaning is still debated. The separation of the head from the body may reflect a ritual meant to prevent the dead from returning. It may reflect the burial of individuals who were executed or who died violent deaths. It may reflect practices connected to specific religious or cultural traditions. Some of the decapitated burials from Roman London show evidence of peri-mortem trauma, injury around the time of death, suggesting execution. Others show no such signs. The complexity of the Roman cemetery record is one of the things that makes Londinium so endlessly interesting to archaeologists. Every burial is a person. Every burial is an argument, if you know how to read it, about who that person was and what their life and death and the culture they lived in meant. And above all of them, above all the cemeteries and all the bones and all the carefully placed grave goods, above all of it, London, going about its business, walking over its dead. The Thames waterfront of Roman London is one of the most intensively studied sections of Roman archaeology anywhere in the world. The reason is both practical and geological. The waterfront area has been repeatedly excavated as development has demanded, and the waterlogged conditions have preserved organic materials that survive nowhere else. What those excavations have revealed is a waterfront of extraordinary scale and complexity. The Roman quays along the north bank of the Thames were massive timber structures, oak piles driven into the riverbed, horizontal planks creating a face against the river. The whole complex extending in some periods by as much as 50 meters beyond the original bank of the Thames. Land reclaimed from the river by dumping debris behind the quay structures and creating new ground. The dendrochronology of the timbers, the dating of the trees used in construction from their ring patterns, has allowed archaeologists to construct a detailed chronology of the waterfront's development. New quays built in the 80s AD, expansion in the early 2nd century, rebuilding after periods of neglect. The history of the waterfront is a history of investment and activity and occasional contraction, reflecting the broader fortunes of the city and its trade. The cargoes that arrived at those quays have left traces. Fragments of the ceramic amphoras in which wine and olive oil were transported, grain, carbonized in fires or simply preserved in the anaerobic mud. The seeds of exotic plants, figs and lentils and coriander brought from the Mediterranean and beyond. Fish bones from species that were not native to British waters, reflecting the import of preserved fish and fish sauce from southern Europe. One of the most remarkable finds from the waterfront excavations is a series of wooden writing tablets that were discarded in the river. Discarded because the messages on them had been received and dealt with, or because they were damaged, or simply because the wax coating had worn out and the tablet was used up. In the anaerobic conditions of the riverbed, the wooden tablets survived. The wax did not. But the iron stylus that had written into the wax had pressed through into the wood in some cases, leaving faint but readable impressions. These tablets are among the most direct windows we have into the daily commercial life of Roman London. They discuss loans and debts. They mention specific individuals by name: Crescens, Titullus, Tibullus. They refer to places. Verulamium, which is St. Albans, appears in one tablet, a reference to the commercial network in which Londinium sat, trading not just with the continent, but with the other towns of the province. One tablet from the Bloomberg excavation, dated to around 62 AD, so just after the Boudican destruction, records a dispute about a debt. The tone is businesslike and slightly aggrieved. Someone owes someone else money, and the matter needs to be settled. The writing is quick, practiced, the handwriting of a literate person accustomed to writing in the course of business. 2 years after everything burned, Londinium is already back to business, already back to disputes about debts. That resilience is one of the things the archaeology of Roman London communicates most powerfully. The destruction of 60 or 61 AD was catastrophic, and the city came back. It came back with more ambition, more stone, more infrastructure. The fire did not end London, it reset it. And the reset produced a city more substantial and more significant than the one that had burned. The port was central to everything that followed. The prosperity of Londinium was built on the river, on the bridge, on the movement of goods in and out of the province. Without the port, there is no forum. Without the port, there is no governor's palace. Without the port, there is no reason for the wall. The river is still there, still tidal at London Bridge, still carrying ships, still doing in some form what it has done for the entire history of the city. The quays are gone, long since rotted into the riverbed, or buried under later reclamation. But the timber piles, the deep ones, are still down there in the mud of the Thames, preserved in the same anaerobic conditions that preserved the writing tablets, waiting for the next excavation, the next moment when development demands a new dig and the archaeology team moves in, and the past comes up out of the ground once more. In September 1954, a building site in the City of London stopped being a building site and became one of the most extraordinary archaeological events of the 20th century. The site was on Walbrook, the street named for the small stream that once ran through the heart of Roman London, the stream that the Romans had partially channeled and partly used as a drain and partly built over in the course of the city's development. A new office building was going up. The excavations had gone down to the level of the Roman remains, and then the builders found something. A curved wall, then more walls, then a floor, then objects in the floor, and then, suddenly unmistakable, the floor plan of a Roman temple. The find was immediately significant. Roman temples in London were not unknown, but their remains were fragmentary and scattered. This one was different. This one was substantially intact. Its walls stood to a significant height. Its floor was preserved. And in and around the floor, or in the debris that had accumulated above it, there were objects. Extraordinary objects. A marble head of the god Mithras, the eyes intact, the face serene, the carved hair bound with a Phrygian cap, the characteristic headgear of this Eastern deity. A marble head of the goddess Minerva, a marble relief of Mithras himself performing the ritual killing of the bull, the tauroctony that was central to Mithraic worship. Other sculpted pieces, other objects of devotion. Londinium had a temple of Mithras, and it was, remarkably, sitting right there beneath the foundations of a City of London office block. Mithras was not a Roman god by origin. The Mithraic religion was an Eastern mystery cult that spread through the Roman Empire in the 1st through 4th centuries, particularly popular among soldiers and merchants, the people who moved along the trade and military routes of the empire and encountered the cult at various points and carried it with them. Mithraic worship was conducted in underground temples called Mithraea, deliberately small and cave-like, meant to replicate the cave in which Mithras was said to have killed the primordial bull, whose blood fertilized the earth. The Walbrook Mithraeum was not underground. It was built at ground level, on the bank of the Walbrook stream, but it was deliberately low-ceilinged and designed for a kind of intimate, mysterious worship that distinguished Mithraic practice from the public religion of the Roman state. Initiates moved through grades of membership, 7 grades in all, each associated with a planet and a symbol. The rituals were secret, shared only among members, which is one of the reasons we know less about Mithraism than about many other ancient religions. The temple was built sometime in the late 2nd century, around 240 AD, according to later dating estimates. It was used for perhaps a century, and then something happened. The marble sculptures were carefully buried, wrapped and hidden beneath the floor of the temple, not smashed, not discarded, not treated as rubbish, deliberately concealed, as if someone expected to come back for them and wanted them to survive until that return. They did not come back. The prevailing interpretation is that the burial of the sculptures happened in the 4th century, as Christianity became the dominant religion of the empire, and the mystery cults faced increasing pressure. The worshippers of Mithras in Londinium, facing a changing religious landscape, hid their sacred objects rather than see them destroyed, and they never retrieved them. When the discovery was made in 1954, the public response was extraordinary. Thousands of people came to the building site to see the excavation. Photographs from the time show queues stretching along Walbrook, ordinary Londoners standing in line to descend into a temporary viewing trench and look at a Roman temple. The newspapers covered it extensively. There was genuine popular excitement about what had been found. There was also a planning crisis. The office development had to go ahead. The schedule could not be indefinitely delayed. The decision was made to record the temple as thoroughly as possible and then move it. The stones of the Mithraeum were dismantled, numbered and stored. The temple was removed. The office building went up. And in a somewhat unfortunate compromise, the stones were later reassembled in a simplified and not entirely accurate reconstruction in a sunken area beside the new building, where they sat for decades in a form that bore limited resemblance to the original. Then, in the early 21st century, the office building was itself demolished to make way for the Bloomberg European headquarters. And Bloomberg, In one of the more remarkable acts of corporate archaeological responsibility in recent memory, funded not only a new excavation of the Mithraeum site, but a full professional reconstruction of the temple in its original location, in a basement space below the new building, at the actual level where it had stood in Roman times. The Bloomberg Space Mithraeum is open today. You can go there. You can descend below the modern street level to the Roman ground surface and stand in a faithful reconstruction of the temple, the walls lit with a slowly shifting amber light, a soundscape of water and ritual playing softly. The space small and enclosed in exactly the way a Mithraic temple was intended to be. The original marble sculptures, cleaned and conserved and extraordinary, are displayed in a museum space above. It is one of the places in London where the distance between the city you are standing in and the city 30 feet below closes to something you can actually feel. And around the Mithraeum, in the same basement excavation, were more writing tablets, hundreds of them. The largest single collection of Roman writing tablets ever found in Britain. The Bloomberg tablets, as they are known, are a window into the daily business life of Roman Londinium that nothing else can provide. They cover decades of transactions. They name hundreds of individuals. They tell the story of a city doing what cities do, which is conducting business, resolving disputes, recording obligations, keeping track of the flow of goods and money and relationships that make an urban economy function. Rome did not leave Britain all at once. It left by degrees, in a process that stretched over decades, beginning in the late 3rd century and completing in the early 5th. And the experience of that process from inside Londinium must have been deeply disorienting. The empire was in trouble long before it finally withdrew from Britain. The 3rd century was a period of almost continuous crisis, with rival emperors, military mutinies, barbarian incursions along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, economic disruption, and plague. The coherence and stability that had characterized the high empire of the 1st and 2nd centuries gave way to a much more turbulent and uncertain world. Britain was not immune to this turbulence. There were usurpations originating in Britain, military commanders declaring themselves emperor and using the legions stationed in the province as their power base. Magnus Maximus in the 380s is the most famous example, a commander based in Britain who took a substantial portion of the British garrison to the continent in pursuit of imperial power, stripping the province of troops that were not fully replaced. The garrison of Britain was declining. The military infrastructure of the province was contracting, and Londinium, which had always been a primarily civilian rather than military city, felt the effects in changed trade patterns, reduced investment in public buildings, and the kind of subtle economic contraction that is hard to see in any single excavation level, but becomes visible when you look at the period as a whole. The archaeological record of Londinium in the 4th century shows signs of change. Some public buildings fell into disrepair and were not maintained. The Forum Basilica, that great symbol of Roman civic investment, appears to have been partially demolished or collapsed in the late 3rd or early 4th century, and its materials were robbed for use elsewhere. The population was probably smaller than it had been at the city's peak. The pattern of new building was different, but the city was not abandoned. People were still there in the 4th century. There were still wealthy individuals investing in high-quality domestic buildings with fine mosaic floors. Christianity was spreading through the population, as it was through the empire, and there may have been a bishop of London by the early 4th century, with a church somewhere in the city. Imports continued, though in reduced quantities and from different sources than in the earlier period. And then, in 410 AD, the Emperor Honorius sent a letter. The dating and interpretation of this letter are contested, as almost everything about the late Roman period in Britain is contested. But the traditional reading is that Honorius, responding to an appeal from the cities of Britain for military assistance against raiders and invaders, wrote back to tell them to look to their own defense. Rome could not help. The legions were needed elsewhere. This was not, in itself, the end. It was more like an official acknowledgement of a situation that had been developing for decades. The professional Roman army was gone from Britain, or largely gone. The administrative links to the imperial centre were broken or breaking. The economic infrastructure that had underpinned Londinium for 3.5 centuries, the trade networks, the provincial taxation system, the supply chains for the army, all of it was disrupted and collapsing. What happened to Londinium after 410 is one of the most debated questions in British archaeology. The traditional view was that the city was fairly quickly abandoned, that the population dispersed into the countryside, and that within a generation or two, the great Roman city was an empty ruin. The evidence cited for this view was the near-total absence of identifiable 5th century material in excavations of the Roman city, a stratigraphic silence that seemed to imply genuine abandonment. That view has been challenged and complicated. The silence may reflect a change in material culture rather than an absence of people. If the population of post-Roman London stopped using ceramic vessels and started using organic containers, wooden bowls and leather buckets and baskets, those materials do not survive in the archaeological record the way pottery does. The silence may be a silence of a particular type of evidence rather than a silence of human presence. What is clear is that by the 6th century, the old Roman city was not functioning as a city in any meaningful sense. The water supply had failed. The drainage had collapsed. The buildings were in various stages of ruin or robbing, their stone and tile being taken for use elsewhere. The forum was gone, or going. The wall still stood, and would stand for centuries more, but it enclosed increasingly empty space. London, the city, shifted. Not far. The Anglo-Saxon settlement that succeeded Roman Londinium, the place that the written sources call Lundenvik, was not inside the Roman walls, but outside them, to the west, in the area around modern Aldwych and the Strand. A different city, in a different place, among the ruins of the old one. And 30 feet below the Saxon settlement, below the medieval growth, below the Reformation and the Great Fire and the Victorian expansion and the Blitz, below all of it, Londinium, still there, waiting. For roughly 500 years, roughly from 400 to 900 AD, Roman London sat beneath the surface of a land that had largely stopped thinking of itself as Roman. The Anglo-Saxons who came to dominate Britain from the 5th century onward knew the ruins were there. They could see them. They could not have missed them. In many places, the Roman walls were still standing to considerable height. The remains of Roman buildings would have been visible above ground, roofless and ruined, but physically present. The roads, that extraordinary network of straight roads that the Romans had laid across the province, continued to be used because there was nothing to replace them. The Anglo-Saxons had words for Roman ruins. They called them, in Old English, enter geviok, the work of giants. Because who else could have built such things? Who else could have laid stone walls 3 miles in circuit and 8 feet thick, raised them 18 feet in the air, built a basilica longer than anything seen since? The sheer physical ambition of Roman construction was beyond the building tradition of early medieval Britain, and the people looking at the ruins seemed to have found them genuinely incomprehensible. Giants had built them, some race of beings no longer present. The Lundinvik settlement, the Anglo-Saxon city outside the Roman walls, grew and contracted, and was raided by Vikings, and finally, in the 9th century, King Alfred of Wessex made a significant decision. He reoccupied the Roman-walled area, recognizing that the old walls still provided a defensive perimeter of extraordinary strength. He called the revived settlement Lundenburg, London Fortress, and the walled city was re-inhabited. Medieval London grew from that reoccupation. The Roman street grid had been mostly forgotten, but the walls remained, and the gates remained, and the basic topography of the hills and the valleys inside the walls, shaped by the same landscape the Romans had built on, reasserted itself as the new medieval city laid out its own streets. Some Roman roads were rediscovered and reused. Others were buried under the accumulation of new building. The Roman city was beneath them, sometimes literally. The foundations of medieval buildings rested on Roman ones. A church built in the medieval period on the site of a Roman temple, using the Roman foundation as the easiest and most practical base for the new structure. Stone robbed from Roman buildings and incorporated into medieval walls. The physical material of Londinium being consumed and digested by the centuries that came after. And below all of it, the parts that were too deep or too waterlogged or simply too well buried to be reached. The Roman street surfaces, the Roman floor levels, the Roman deposits of ash and pottery and organic material and coin and bone that make up the stratigraphic record of the city. They were accumulating. With every century, more material settling above them. Medieval London built and burned and rebuilt, the Great Fire of 1666 adding its own destruction layer to the sequence. And beneath all of it, the Roman layers went deeper and deeper below the modern surface. By the 19th century, the Roman city was approximately 30 feet below the street. By the 20th century, the same. 30 feet of accumulated history, layer upon layer upon layer. And then, people started digging. The Great Fire of London in 1666 was a catastrophe. It burned approximately 13,000 houses and 87 churches. It destroyed the medieval city, from the bridge to the temple, from the river to the city wall. When the smoke cleared and the embers cooled, there was nothing above ground for a wide area of the City of London except ruins and ash. And among the ruins and ash, visible for the first time in centuries, were Roman remains. The rapid clearance and rebuilding of the city after the fire necessarily encountered the Roman levels. Roman pottery, Roman masonry, Roman coins. The people doing the rebuilding were not archaeologists, and most of what they found was treated as builders treat things in their way, moved aside, used as fill, occasionally set aside if it was interesting enough. But some of it was noticed. Some of it was recorded. The figure of John Stow, whose Survey of London, published in 1598, had recorded the city as he knew it, had already noted Roman finds in the course of his observations. After the fire, new surveys and new building created new opportunities, and a tradition of recording Roman London begins to develop in this period. Through the 18th century, the awareness of Roman London grew. Coins were found in enormous quantities. Roman pottery was identified and collected. The understanding that there was a Roman city beneath the modern one was becoming, among educated Londoners, common knowledge. But the Victorian period is where the real reckoning begins. Victorian London was a city in the process of radical transformation. New sewers, new water mains, new underground railway lines, new foundations for new commercial buildings. The ground was being opened up on an unprecedented scale, in more places and to greater depths than had ever before been required. Every major building project in the Victorian city of London hit Roman deposits. Every new sewer trench in the area of the old Roman city cut through Roman layers. The contractors who dug these trenches were not trained to recognize or preserve what they found, and the loss of Roman archaeology during the Victorian construction boom is one of the great unretrievable losses in the history of British heritage. But not everything was lost. A society of antiquaries' tradition of visiting significant finds and recording them developed. Individuals with an interest in Roman London, men like Charles Roach Smith, whose collection of Roman London artifacts eventually formed the nucleus of what is now the Museum of London's Roman collections, made it their business to visit building sites, record what was found, and rescue what could be rescued. The mosaic floors were particularly striking. When a building was demolished and its floor taken up, the Roman mosaic floor beneath might be revealed. Geometric patterns in red and white and black tesserae, the small tiles set by Roman craftspeople in the late 1st or 2nd century, still sharp and clear after 17 centuries. Some of these floors were lifted and preserved. Others were broken up in the course of construction and lost. The process of discovery was haphazard, accidental, dependent on the interest of individual contractors and the speed of the work. An observant workman might set aside a notable find and show it to someone who knew what it was. An indifferent one would shovel it into a barrow with the rest of the spoil, and it would vanish. This is how Roman London was discovered for most of the 19th century, moment by moment, site by site, accident by accident. The professional discipline of archaeology, with its systematic methods and its legal frameworks for the protection of sites, was in its infancy in Victorian Britain. It would take another century and a catastrophe before London's relationship with its Roman past would truly change. The German bombing campaign against London in 1940 and 1941 was, from almost every perspective, a catastrophe of enormous proportions. Thousands of civilians killed, hundreds of thousands of homes destroyed. The physical fabric of the city damaged and, in some areas, obliterated. But the Blitz had an unintended consequence for archaeology. When a building is bombed and its ruins are cleared, the ground beneath is exposed. And in the City of London, where the bombing was heavy and the subsequent clearance was extensive, what was exposed was often Roman. The same area of the City of London that had been built up for centuries over the Roman deposits was now, in places, cleared back to near the Roman level, with only the modern road surface and a few feet of Victorian and medieval fill between the surface and the Roman layers. A decision was made, in the immediate post-war period, to allow some proper archaeological investigation of the bomb-damaged areas before the rebuilding began. The resources were limited. The urgency of rebuilding was real and understandable. But the window was there, and some archaeologists moved through it. Professor William Francis Grimes was the central figure. He directed excavations across a number of the bombed sites in the City of London between 1946 and 1962, and the results were transformative for the understanding of Roman Londinium. It was Grimes who directed the excavation of the Temple of Mithras in 1954, the discovery that brought Roman London to public attention in a way it had never achieved before. But the Mithraeum was only one of his discoveries. Grimes excavated sections of the Roman wall. He excavated the fort at Cripplegate, a military installation built in the early 2nd century in the northwest corner of the walled city, whose existence had not been previously known. He excavated Roman street surfaces, Roman building foundations, Roman cemeteries. Each discovery added to the picture. The post-war excavations established what would become the standard approach for urban archaeology in London. Work quickly. Work before the developers arrive. Record as thoroughly as possible. Rescue what can be rescued. Accept that much will be lost to the requirements of redevelopment. It was not a satisfying approach. Every archaeologist who worked in London in the post-war decades knew that what was being recorded was a fraction of what existed, that more was being destroyed by each new building than was being understood. But the alternative, halting the rebuilding of a city devastated by bombing in order to fully excavate its Roman remains, was simply not realistic. The solution, or the attempt at a solution, was legislation. The Ancient Monuments Acts were strengthened. The idea of developer-funded archaeology, the requirement that developers pay for archaeological investigation of significant sites before construction begins, was slowly developed over the following decades and eventually codified in planning guidance. The principle was simple. If you want to build on a site in the historic core of London, you must first commission an archaeological investigation of that site. A team of archaeologists will excavate, record, and analyze the finds. They will publish their results, and then the development can proceed. This approach, known as developer-funded archaeology, or sometimes rescue archaeology, has transformed the understanding of Roman London over the last 40 years. It is imperfect. The time available is often limited. The requirement to reach the necessary depth for construction foundations sometimes means that the archaeologists are working against the clock. But it has produced an extraordinary volume of knowledge. The early 21st century brought two of the most significant archaeological investigations in the history of Roman London, and both of them were products of the developer-funded model. The first was the Bloomberg excavation. When the American financial company Bloomberg decided to build its European headquarters on a site near Cannon Street in the City of London, the site assessment revealed that it sat directly over some of the most archaeologically sensitive ground in the entire Roman city. The Walbrook Stream. The area of the Mithraeum. Ground that had been waterlogged for 2,000 years and might therefore contain extraordinary organic preservation. Bloomberg, to their considerable credit, responded by commissioning one of the most intensive archaeological excavations ever conducted in London. The Museum of London Archaeology, working on the site from 2010 to 2014, excavated more than 12,000 individual Roman artifacts. They uncovered new sections of the Mithraeum. They found, in the waterlogged deposits, the writing tablets that have already been discussed. They recovered dendrochronologically dated timbers from Roman waterfront structures, shoes, leather, plant remains, wood, rope, the organic residues of Roman daily life preserved by 2,000 years of anaerobic conditions. The report on the Bloomberg excavation runs to multiple volumes. The writing tablets alone have been the subject of a substantial separate publication. The excavation has become a landmark study in the archaeology of Roman London, and the objects it produced, now displayed in the Bloomberg Space Museum, represent some of the most significant Roman finds ever made in Britain. The second major project was Crossrail. The Crossrail project, now the Elizabeth Line, required the construction of a new railway tunnel running east to west beneath central London. The scale of the civil engineering was enormous, and the tunnel route passed through the heart of some of the most archaeologically sensitive ground in the city, including significant stretches of the Roman city's area. The archaeological program that accompanied Crossrail construction was, in terms of scale and duration, unprecedented in London archaeology. Excavations at Farringdon, at Liverpool Street, at Whitechapel, at dozens of intermediate sites. Not all of these were in Roman territory, but the ones that were produced significant results. At Farringdon, Roman road surfaces were found in excellent condition. the ruts of Roman vehicles pressed into the metalling of the road surface, still visible and still measurable after 19 centuries. The drainage ditches beside the road, the deposits alongside it. At Liverpool Street, the cross-rail excavation found one of the most significant Roman cemeteries ever encountered in London. Hundreds of burials. Individuals from across the period of Roman occupation, ranging from the earliest decades to the late Roman period. Isotope analysis on a significant sample of these individuals is ongoing, adding to the growing picture of the diverse origins of Londinium's population. The Roman remains found in crossrail excavations were, as all such archaeological discoveries in London now are, fully recorded before the tunnelling proceeded. The three-dimensional survey data, the photographs, the sample analyses, the object catalogues, all of it is in the archives, adding to the accumulated knowledge of what lies beneath London. And what all of this excavation, all of this accumulated knowledge from the Bloomberg site and the Crossrail tunnel and the decades of developer-funded archaeology before it tells us is something that genuinely changes how we understand the history of Britain. 30 feet, approximately 9 meters. That is, very roughly, the distance between the modern street surface of the City of London and the Roman ground surface beneath it. It is not a uniform depth. It varies from place to place, depending on the local topography and the accumulation of different types of deposit. In some areas, particularly where medieval buildings had deep basements, or where Victorian construction was particularly invasive, the Roman levels have been disturbed or removed entirely. In other areas, particularly the waterlogged zones near the old river channels, the preservation is extraordinary, and the Roman levels are deep and complex and rich with material. But 30 feet is the general answer to the question, how far down is Roman London? That distance, those 30 feet, represent approximately 2,000 years of human activity. Each layer of deposit, each stratum that the archaeologist distinguishes from the ones above and below it, represents a period of time. The Boudican destruction layer is 10 centimeters of red ash that preserves the moment when the first Londinium burned. Above it, the deposits of the rebuilt city, street surfaces repaired and repaired again, building layers reflecting new construction over old, dumps of debris and rubbish that accumulated at the edges of properties. Above that, the late Roman deposits, thinner in many places, reflecting the contracting city of the 4th century. Above that, the silence of the post-Roman period, a layer of dark earth that is still the subject of debate among archaeologists about what exactly it represents, and who, if anyone, was living on it. Then the Anglo-Saxon levels. Then the medieval levels, accumulating over 5 centuries of continuous urban occupation. The layers of the Great Fire, the Victorian rebuilding, and finally, the modern surface. Every one of those layers is a text. Archaeologists have developed extraordinary skill in reading the language of stratigraphy, in understanding what different types of deposit mean, in extracting information from the texture and colour and content of soil that has been in the ground for centuries. The Boudican destruction layer, for example, is not just red. It is red in a particular way. The clay above it, which was the floor of a 1st century building, has been heated and has changed colour from the heat of the fire above it. The ash within it is from specific types of wood. The objects within it are in positions that reflect the moment of the fire. A storage jar still upright in a corner. The walls of the building collapsed around it. Personal objects lying where they were dropped or where they fell. The layer is not just a record that fire happened. It is a 3-dimensional record of the fire itself. The Roman street surfaces tell their own story. They were maintained. The Romans took their roads seriously, and the evidence shows repeated repairs, new layers of gravel added over the top of worn surfaces, drainage channels cleared and recutted. A Roman street excavated in careful sequence reveals the investment of the city's authorities in maintaining the infrastructure over decades. And, in the sections of the Roman city that have been most extensively excavated, the complete sequence from 1st century to 4th century is visible in the ground. Not intact, not without gaps and disturbances, but recognizable. The building of Londinium, the destruction and rebuilding, the expansion and investment of the 2nd century, the changes of the 3rd century, the contraction of the 4th, all of it is there in the layers, readable to the trained eye. The waterlogged deposits are the most extraordinary. At the Bloomberg site, at the waterfront excavations, at the Walbrook Valley sites, the anaerobic conditions have stopped the biological processes that normally destroy organic material. Wood survives. Leather survives. Plant remains survive. The residues of Roman activities, the food waste, the workshop debris, the personal rubbish that was dropped into a damp corner of a building, all of it survives. In one deposit from the Walbrook excavations, archaeologists found the remains of a Roman sewer. The concretion inside the drain was analysed, and it contained the microscopic remains of intestinal parasites. Roundworm, whipworm. The same parasites that afflict humans today. The same parasites that the Romans carried in their guts 2,000 years ago, their eggs preserved in the calcified sewer deposit. Roman intestinal health, recoverable from 30 feet of London ground. It is this kind of connection, this intimacy across the centuries, that makes Roman London so extraordinary. The monuments are impressive. The scale of the city, the forum and the wall and the amphitheatre is genuinely astonishing when you know the numbers. But it is the human scale, the writing tablets and the shoes and the parasites and the carefully placed grave goods and the graffiti on the pots that makes Londinium feel real in a way that the grand narrative of Roman power never quite does. For all the excavation, for all the analysis, for all the extraordinary results of the last 2 centuries of archaeological work in London, there are things we still do not know. Significant things. Foundational things. We do not know exactly how many people lived in Londinium. The estimates range from 30,000 to 60,000 at the city's peak, and the range reflects genuine uncertainty. Population estimates for ancient cities are always difficult, depending on assumptions about household size and building density that may not be accurate. Londinium's population is not precisely recoverable from the evidence we have. We do not know where the 1st century governor's residence was. We know approximately where the 2nd century palace was, the substantial building by the Thames waterfront with its garden and mosaic floors. But the administration had to be somewhere before that, and the precise location of the earliest provincial administrative centre has not been definitively established. We do not know where the 1st century London Bridge was positioned exactly. The general vicinity is established. The Thames crossing was somewhere very close to modern London Bridge, but the precise alignment, which matters for understanding the layout of the early city, has not been confirmed by direct evidence of the bridge structure. We do not know the full extent of the Roman religious landscape of Londinium. The Temple of Mithras is known. The possible Temple of Isis is proposed. There were almost certainly temples to Jupiter and other Roman deities, as every Roman city had. There may have been an early Christian church by the 4th century, but the locations of most of these religious buildings remain unknown. We do not know what happened to Londinium's population at and after the end of Roman administration. Where did the people go? Did they stay in the city and gradually disperse? Did they migrate to the countryside? Did some of them remain for generations in and around the walls, maintaining some form of community in the increasingly ruined city? The archaeology of the post-Roman period in London is genuinely difficult, the absence of material culture making it hard to trace what was happening to the people who had been there. We do not know the full extent of the Roman road network in the immediate vicinity of Londinium. The major roads are known. The secondary streets inside the city have been largely traced, but there are areas where the road pattern remains unclear, and there are certainly buildings and features in those unclear areas that have not yet been found. These are not failures of archaeology, they are the condition of archaeology, the permanent incompleteness of the record. Every excavation answers questions and generates new ones. Every analysis narrows the range of uncertainty in some areas, while revealing new uncertainties in others. The ground beneath London still holds the answers to most of these questions. The answers are there. They are 30 feet down, preserved in the deposits of the Roman city, waiting for the next excavation, the next analysis, the next moment when the need to build something new creates the opportunity to look at what was there before. We began by saying that the Roman city found beneath London changes everything we thought we understood about Britain. Let us, after all of this, try to say why that is true. The usual story of Britain begins with 1066 and the Norman conquest, or perhaps with Alfred the Great, or perhaps with the Anglo-Saxon settlement. These are the origin points that most people thinking about British history think of. The story of England as a nation, as a culture, as a political entity is usually told as beginning somewhere in that medieval or late Anglo-Saxon period. Roman Britain is treated in this conventional narrative as a prelude, an interruption, a period of foreign rule that came and went and left little permanent mark on the development of what would eventually become England. The Romans were there, then they left. The Anglo-Saxons came, and English history began. The evidence from beneath London makes this story untenable. Rome was in Britain for nearly 400 years. 400 years is longer than the entire history of the United States as an independent nation. It is longer than the distance in time between Elizabeth I and the present day. It is a span of time within which enormous cultural, social, economic and physical transformation can occur, and occurred. The road network that the Romans built was used continuously from the time of its construction through the medieval period, and in many cases into the modern era. The routes of Roman roads are the routes of modern roads in significant stretches of Britain. The A1 through much of its length follows the Roman Ermine Street. The A2 follows Watling Street to the coast. The A5 follows Watling Street to the northwest. The physical infrastructure of movement through the landscape of Britain was laid by Roman engineers and has never been entirely replaced. The Christianity that came to define English culture and identity, and which shaped everything from the legal system to the literary tradition to the art and architecture of the nation, arrived in Britain first during the Roman period. The earliest Christian communities in Britain were Roman communities. The first martyrs, St. Alban among them, were Roman martyrs. The institutional church that survived the post-Roman period and eventually became the Church of England had its roots in the late Roman Church. The Latin language that the Romans brought permeated the English language so thoroughly that the proportion of Latinate vocabulary in modern English is difficult to calculate but certainly substantial. The legal language, the administrative vocabulary, the theological terminology, all of it built on a Latin foundation that came to Britain with Rome. The very shape of London, the position of its streets and its gates and its walls, was determined by the Roman city. The walled area of the medieval and early modern city of London was the walled area of Roman Londinium. The gates of the medieval city were the gates of the Roman city. The street called London Wall follows the course of the Roman wall. The layout of the City of London today is, in its bones, a Roman layout. And the city, 30 feet below the modern surface, with its forum and its basilica and its amphitheatre and its Mithraeum and its port and its tens of thousands of people from across the Roman world, is not a foreign implantation in British soil. It is British history. It is the history of the island, as much a part of what Britain is as anything that came before or after. To say that the Roman city beneath London changes everything is not an exaggeration. It changes where we think Britain's story begins. It changes how we understand the connections between this island and the wider world. It changes what we mean when we talk about the roots of British culture and identity and institutions. The story of Britain did not begin in 1066. It did not begin with the Anglo-Saxons. It began, or rather it took one of its most decisive turns, on a morning in 43 AD, when Roman soldiers crossed a wide grey river and looked up at two low gravel hills and decided to build something. What they built is still there, 30 feet down, waiting. There is a walk you can do in London. It begins at Tower Hill, where a section of the Roman wall stands beside the Underground station. The Roman stone dark and ancient at the base, the medieval repairs rising above in a slightly different colour and texture. You stand in front of it, this wall, and you run your eye along the Roman courses, and you try to understand that the hands that placed these stones, the Roman labourers working in the late 2nd century AD, placed them as practically and without ceremony as anyone lays a wall. This was not a monument to them. It was a job, a piece of infrastructure. It happened to last 2,000 years. From Tower Hill, you walk north and west along London Wall, the street named for what lies beneath it. The modern street is busy with office workers and vans, and the ordinary noise of a working city. Beneath the road surface, the Roman wall runs in the same direction, not always directly below the modern street, but close to it, sometimes visible in car parks and basements, sometimes not. At Aldersgate and at Cripplegate, where the medieval churches stand, you pass the sites of Roman gates. The gates themselves are gone, but the streets still thread through the same gaps in the old wall line that the Roman gates once defined. At the Guildhall Art Gallery, if you go in and descend to the basement, you can stand in the surviving curved wall of the Roman amphitheatre. The gallery was built partly over the amphitheatre site specifically to preserve it, and the remains are displayed with appropriate drama, the low amber lighting and the ancient curved stone, giving the space a weight that modern buildings rarely manage. From there to the Bloomberg space, where the Mithraeum waits in its reconstructed form, the amber light and the sound of running water, the marble head of Mithras looking calmly out from the display case. From the Bloomberg space toward the waterfront, toward the Thames, where the Roman quays once extended into the river, and where the ships from the continent came in, loaded with wine and oil and marble and luxury, and all the material evidence of an empire at its height. And standing at the embankment, looking across the river towards Southwark, where the Roman settlement on the south bank once stood, where the road came up from the coast to meet the bridge, you are standing at the approximate point where Londinium had its port, where the city turned its face to the river and the river brought the world to it. 30 feet below you, the Roman waterfront is in the ground. The timber piles, the organic deposits, the shoes and the writing tablets and the grain and the fish sauce and the fragments of amphora, and the bones of the animals that were eaten on the quayside, and the scraps of leather and rope, and the 10,000 small evidences of daily life in a major Roman port city. London is built on London. The city you walk through every day is walking on top of another city, a city that was as real and as busy and as full of people and ambition and commerce and conflict and love and death as any city that has existed anywhere at any time. And that city is 30 feet down. It is not gone. It is waiting. There is one more layer of evidence about Roman London that deserves its own attention, and it is one of the most democratic forms of historical record that exists. The coins. Hundreds of thousands of Roman coins have been found in London over the centuries, in the Thames, in the soil of construction sites, in the cemeteries, in the floor deposits of demolished buildings, in the drains, in the kind of random, scattered distribution that reflects the fact that coins are small and metal, and, unlike most other objects, tend to survive in the ground almost indefinitely. The Roman coin in London is such a common find that individual specimens are not individually remarkable. Any site in the City of London that reaches Roman levels will produce coins. They are the wallpaper of Roman London archaeology, present everywhere, the constant background noise of the site reports. But they are, collectively, an extraordinary document. Because the coinage of the Roman Empire was issued centrally, with dates and names and images that allow very precise identification, the portrait of the emperor on the obverse, the reverse type which changed regularly to carry specific messages of imperial propaganda, the mint mark telling you which of the imperial mints struck this particular coin, the condition of the coin's wear, which tells you something about how long it circulated before being lost or deposited. Put all of this together across hundreds of thousands of coins from a single site, and you have a picture of economic activity across time. The flourishing of coin supply in the late 1st and 2nd centuries, reflecting the economic boom of Londinium's peak. The disruptions of the 3rd century, visible in the coin record, periods of debasement and irregular supply. The very late Roman coins, bronze and debased, and sometimes clipped or modified, that represent the economic life of the city in its final decades. The Thames has produced a particularly unusual category of coin find. Coins deposited deliberately in the river, not lost by accident, but thrown in as offerings. The practice of making votive deposits in water was ancient in Britain, older than Rome, going back into the prehistoric period when lakes and rivers were considered sacred, and the act of throwing something of value into water was an act of communication with the divine. The Romans brought their own water deities and their own tradition of votive deposits, and the result in the Thames is a layer of intentional deposits across the entire Roman period. An individual standing on the Roman bridge above the Thames, throwing a coin into the water below. The prayer or wish or obligation that accompanied the act is gone. The coin is in the river, in the mud, and the metal detectorist or the archaeologist will find it 2,000 years later. The act of throwing it, the moment of intention, the specific human being who reached into their purse and took out a coin and stood at the railing of the bridge and offered it to the river, all of that is lost. But the coin survives. The coin is always there. One of the most evocative finds from the Roman Thames is not a coin, but is related to coinage. It is a small object of lead, a curse tablet. The Romans used curse tablets extensively. Thin sheets of lead, inscribed with a curse directed at a specific person, often someone who had stolen something or wronged the writer in some way. The tablet would be rolled up or folded and thrown into water or deposited in a temple, or buried in a grave, the act of deposition making the curse active. The Thames has produced curse tablets. In one of them, preserved despite having spent nearly 2,000 years in the river, a Roman Londoner has inscribed a list of names. These are the names of people who might have stolen the specific item, probably a cloak or a garment. The tablet specifying that whoever among these individuals took the item should be cursed until they confessed and returned it. The list of names on the tablet is a mixture of Latin names and Celtic British names. The person writing it, the victim of the theft, may have been from either tradition. The people named as potential thieves are clearly from both. This is Londinium as it really was. Not a purely Roman city overlaid on a passive British population, but a genuinely mixed community, where Latin and Celtic names sat together in the same list, where the victim and the thief might be from any background, where the common currency, literally and metaphorically, was Roman, but the population was everything. That piece of lead, folded up and thrown into the Thames in anger and frustration, and the particular emotion of someone who has had something stolen from them, is one of the most human documents in the archaeology of Roman London. The emotion in it is completely contemporary. The feeling of having something taken, the desire for justice or revenge, the act of making the grievance formal, even if only in a ritual that you might privately doubt. These are not feelings that belong to the Roman period. They are feelings that belong to all time. The Thames received it. The Thames kept it. And the Thames gave it back, eventually, to the people who could read it and understand what it meant. That, in the end, is what Roman London does to you, if you spend enough time with it. It stops being ancient. It stops being other. The 30 feet of separation between the Roman ground surface and the modern street becomes not a barrier, but a connection. You look down through all those layers and you see not a foreign civilization in a distant past, but the same human impulse to build and trade and worship and grieve and celebrate and curse the person who stole your cloak. It is all there. 30 feet below the city you walk through, patient and quiet, and full of everything that has ever been human. We have talked about the adults of Roman London, the merchants and the administrators and the soldiers and the priests and the craftspeople. We have talked about them through the evidence of their objects and their writing and their bones. But the children were there too. The children of Londinium are one of the most affecting categories of evidence in the Roman archaeology of the city. They are present in the cemeteries. A proportion of any ancient urban population were children because child mortality in the ancient world was high by modern standards. The bones of children from Roman London have been found in every cemetery that has been extensively excavated. They are present in the graves with particular poignancy because the objects buried with them often reflect very directly the human reality of grief across time. A small pottery dog, a toy, a miniature vessel, a child-sized version of an adult object, amulets, small protective objects that parents hung around their children's necks against illness and misfortune. Coins placed on the eyes or in the mouth for the journey. One burial from the Eastern Cemetery is a child buried with a small oil lamp. The lamp was placed beside the head, as if to light the way. The person who arranged that burial, the parent or the relative, or the person responsible for the child's care, chose that particular object for that particular purpose. The gesture is completely legible across 2,000 years. You know exactly what it meant to put a lamp beside a sleeping child. Children appear in the writing tablets too, indirectly. The legal and financial texts that make up most of the tablet record occasionally mention arrangements that concern the welfare of children, the transfer of property that would protect an heir, the settlement of a debt that was incurred in connection with a household that included dependents. Children are in the background of the administrative world of Londinium, present in the documents that governed the property and the contracts of the adults around them. The children who grew up in Londinium in the 1st and 2nd centuries were growing up in a city that, by the standards of the ancient world, was sophisticated and stimulating and connected to the wider world. They would have heard multiple languages on the streets. They would have seen ships coming in from the continent, people from distant places, goods they had no name for. They would have attended the amphitheatre, or been kept away from it, depending on their circumstances and their guardians. They would have been educated, if their families could afford it, in Latin and Greek, in the letters and numbers that were the keys to participation in the Roman economic and administrative world. They would have grown up and become the adults of Londinium, the merchants and the administrators and the craftspeople, and they would have had children of their own. And those children would have grown up in the same city, the same streets, the same view of the Thames from the bridge, the same sounds and smells of a working port. Generation after generation. For nearly 400 years. The continuity of it is staggering when you hold it in mind. Londinium was not a brief Roman experiment. It was a city that functioned across generations, across centuries, that became home not just to the people who came to it from elsewhere, but to the people who were born in it and knew no other place. People whose grandparents and great-grandparents had been born in Londinium. People for whom the Roman city was simply, naturally, entirely home. They are all in the ground beneath London. All of them. The children with their small clay dogs, the merchants with their writing tablets, the priests of Mithras with their carefully hidden marble sculptures, the woman from the Mediterranean who came to Londinium as a young woman and died there and was buried in a lead coffin with a glass mirror and a jet pin. All of them, 30 feet down, in the city they built and lived in and loved and lost and left behind. And the city above them, the city of the 21st century, goes about its business. The traffic moves. The office workers cross the bridge. The tourist stops at the heritage plaque and reads it and moves on. The archaeologist descends into another trench and begins again the careful, meticulous, always slightly desperate work of reading what the earth has to say. The earth has much to say. It has been saying it for a very long time. One of the most contested and fascinating questions in the history of Roman Britain, and by extension in the history of London specifically, is the question of continuity. Did anything survive the end of Roman administration? Not the buildings, not the infrastructure, but the people, the communities, the families who had been Roman Londoners for 3 and 4 and 5 generations. What happened to them when the administration collapsed and the troops left, and the coins stopped coming and the trade routes unravelled? The conventional view, for a long time, was that there was a radical break, that the sub-Roman period, the decades and generations after 410 AD, saw the populations of Roman cities either dying out or dispersing entirely, and that the people who eventually inhabited the former Roman cities in the early medieval period were Anglo-Saxon incomers, who had largely replaced the native Romano-British population. That view is now seriously challenged by genetic evidence. The analysis of ancient DNA from skeletal remains across Britain has produced results that complicate the simple replacement story. There is continuity of ancestry in the British population that links back through the Roman period to the pre-Roman Iron Age. The genetic profile of modern Britain is not one of simple replacement, but of layering, with different contributions from different periods, including contributions that trace back before any Germanic migration. What this means for London specifically is still being worked out. The genetic evidence is aggregated across broad periods and wide geographies, and extracting from it a specific story about what happened to the people of Roman Londinium is not straightforward. But the broad implication is that some of the descendants of Roman Londoners are still here. Somewhere in the genetic ancestry of modern Londoners, there are people who stood on the Roman bridge and crossed the Roman Forum and prayed in the temple of Mithras and buried their dead outside the Roman gates. The continuity is not institutional. It is not cultural, not in any continuous and traceable way. The Latin language of Londinium did not survive in the city. The Roman law did not persist in the post-Roman period in the same form. The administrative structures dissolved. The physical city fell into ruin. But the people may have been more continuous than the story usually allows. The children of Londinium may have had children of their own, and those children may have had children, and the thread may not have broken entirely, but simply become very thin, running through centuries of turbulence and transformation until it emerges, changed almost beyond recognition, in the population of a city that sits on top of the city that those original people built. London on top of London. People above people. The same ground, the same river, the same 2,000 years of stories in the earth. All of it waiting, 30 feet down, for the next spade to break the surface and begin, once again, the patient work of listening to what the ground has to say. If you have been with me for this entire journey, through the Roman invasion and the building of Londinium and the fire and the rebuilding and the wall and the Mithraeum and the excavations and the writing tablets and all of it, then I want to thank you for that patience and that attention. This is not a small story. It is, in many ways, the foundational story of one of the world's great cities. The archaeology of Roman London is ongoing. Every year, somewhere in the city of London, another excavation is commissioned, another site is investigated, another small piece of the picture is clarified or complicated. The questions that remain unanswered are still being pursued. The ground still holds answers that have not yet been found. If this has made you curious, I would encourage you to seek out the Roman Gallery at the Museum of London, which holds one of the finest collections of Roman urban archaeology anywhere in the world. Go to the Bloomberg space and stand in the Mithraeum. Walk the route of the Roman wall. Look at the blue plaques and the heritage markers that acknowledge, quietly and often easily missed, the Roman city that lies beneath the modern one. London is a city with a very long memory. Most of that memory is in the ground, 30 feet below the pavements, patient and enduring and full of stories. And the story of Londinium, the city that the Romans built and the city that became the seed of everything that followed, is one of the most remarkable stories in the long and complicated history of this island. If you enjoyed this, and if it helped you rest, then that makes it worthwhile. History for sleep. Because the past is deep and quiet and full of the kind of weight that settles the mind and slows the breath and reminds us that we are a very small part of a very long story. And somewhere beneath this city, the story is still in the ground. Sleep well.